Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from those who have suffered the most. When you've lost everything, a simple gesture from a stranger can change the course of your entire life. In the mountains of Montana, 1947, Lotte Schneider is a German prisoner of war, stranded in a fierce snowstorm miles from her work camp. She's alone, cold, and certain she won't survive the night. Then Eli McBride finds her. He's a widower who lost 2 sons in the war, and he has every reason to hate what she represents. But when he sees her struggling through the snow, he makes a choice that surprises them both. He gives her his horse and walks beside her through the bitter cold. What starts as a rescue becomes something neither expected. In the silence of the wilderness, 2 broken people begin to heal each other. Can love grow between former enemies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1947 painted the Montana highlands in shades of amber and rust, but the beauty held little comfort for those who called the Clearwater work camp home. Nestled in a valley 30 miles northeast of Missoula, the camp housed 43 German women, remnants of a war that had ended 2 years prior, but whose echoes still reverberated through the pine-scented air. Lotte Schneider pressed her face against the cold glass of the barracks window, watching the morning mist rise from the distant peaks. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving things that should have broken her. Her blonde hair, once carefully pinned in the fashion of a proper Frankfurt nurse, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her hands, calloused from months of camp labor, still moved with the precise grace of someone trained to heal. The photograph tucked inside her coat pocket crinkled as she shifted. Klaus, her younger brother, smiled up at her from the worn Wehrmacht portrait, 19 years old forever, his medic's cross barely visible on his collar. She'd carried that photograph through the bombing of Frankfurt, through the chaos of the American advance, through the long journey across an ocean to this strange land where former enemies were expected to earn their keep. Chopping wood and mending fences. Another beautiful morning in paradise, muttered Greta from the bunk beside her. The older woman's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd given up hope of ever seeing home again. Wonder what backbreaking labor they'll find for us today. Lotte didn't respond. She'd learned that hope was a fragile thing here, easily crushed by careless words. Instead, she pulled on her worn wool coat and headed for the mess hall, where watery coffee and hard biscuits waited to fuel another day of what the camp administrators politely called rehabilitation through honest work. The camp stretched across a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to touch the sky itself. Wooden barracks housed the women, while a separate building served as both mess hall and meeting room. The administrative office occupied a converted cabin near the entrance, where Sergeant Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 50s, managed the daily operations with the weary efficiency of someone counting days until retirement. 20 miles to the west, in a cabin that sat like a lonely sentinel against the tree line, Eli McBride woke to the same mountain dawn. The silence that greeted him each morning had become both companion and torment. No voices calling from the kitchen, no boots stomping up the porch steps, no laughter echoing from the barn where his sons had once helped with morning chores. The hand-carved wooden cross on his nightstand caught the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window. Simple pine, smoothed by his own weathered hands. It bore no inscription save the dates. Thomas McBride, 1925-1944, carved on one arm. Samuel McBride, 1923-1944 on the other. He'd made it himself, working through long nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the memories of 2 folded flags and a chaplain's hollow words pressed too heavily on his chest. At 52, Eli had the lean build of a man who'd spent his life working the land. His hands, scarred from decades of ranch work, moved with practiced efficiency as he dressed in flannel and denim, pulled on boots that had walked these mountains for 20 years. His beard, more gray than brown now, framed a face that had once been quick to smile. These days, the mirrors in his cabin reflected a stranger, someone who'd forgotten how to find joy in sunrise or satisfaction in a day's honest work. The ranch had been his grandfather's originally, carved from wilderness when Montana was still territory. 3 generations of McBrides had worked this land, raised cattle and children, buried their dead in the small cemetery behind the cabin where wildflowers grew thick in summer. Now Eli tended it alone, keeping the fences mended and the stock fed out of habit more than hope. His weekly trips to town had become exercises in endurance. The residents of Cedar Falls treated him with the careful kindness reserved for those touched by tragedy. Mrs. Henderson at the general store always asked how he was managing, her eyes full of the same pity that made him want to turn around and ride straight back to his mountains. The postmaster, old Jim Carlisle, inevitably mentioned how proud Tom and Sam would be of their father, carrying on despite everything. Despite everything. The phrase followed him like smoke, clinging to his clothes and his conscience. Despite losing the woman who'd been his anchor for 25 years to pneumonia in 42, despite watching his boys march off to war with their heads high and their mother's eyes, despite the telegram that had arrived on a Tuesday morning that changed the color of the sky forever. Back at the camp, Lotte moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who'd learned that structure provided a kind of salvation. After breakfast, the women were divided into work details. Some tended the camp's vegetable garden, coaxing the last harvest from soil that would soon freeze solid. Others worked in the laundry, scrubbing clothes and bedding with soap that turned their hands raw. Lotte usually found herself assigned to maintenance, mending torn canvas, replacing broken hinges, tasks that required the steady hands and careful attention to detail that had once saved lives in field hospitals. Today felt different, though she couldn't say why. The air carried a chill that spoke of weather changing, and the mountains seemed closer somehow, their peaks wreathed in clouds that hadn't been there yesterday. Sergeant Morrison gathered the work details with unusual urgency, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied the sky. "Storm coming in faster than expected," he announced, his breath visible in the crisp air. "We need to get the last of the firewood gathered before it hits. Lotte, take Greta and Anna up to the timberline. Build those carts and get back here before noon." Lotte nodded, already reaching for the heavy gloves that would protect her hands from splinters and rough bark. The work was hard, but she'd grown to appreciate the solitude it offered. Up in the timber, away from the constant presence of guards and the weight of 42 other women struggling with their own forms of grief, she could almost imagine herself free. The nursing kit hidden beneath her mattress back in the barracks was a reminder of who she'd once been. Medical supplies salvaged from the field hospital where she'd served, bandages, antiseptic, surgical thread, carefully preserved against the day she might need them again. It was against camp regulations to possess such items, but Lotte had seen too much suffering to give up the tools that might ease someone's pain. Klaus had been a medic too, serving with the 3rd Mountain Division when they'd been overrun somewhere in the Italian Alps. His last letter, delivered 3 months after his death, had spoken of wanting to help people heal once the fighting stopped. "We've seen enough breaking, Lotte," he'd written in his careful script. "And when this ends, we must remember how to mend things." As she loaded split logs into the wooden cart, Lotte wondered if her brother would recognize the woman she'd become. The soft-spoken nurse who'd once believed in the inherent goodness of people felt like someone from another lifetime. The war had burned away illusions, leaving behind someone harder but perhaps more honest about the world's capacity for both cruelty and unexpected grace. The other women worked with practiced efficiency, their breath forming small clouds in the increasingly cold air. Conversations were sparse, partly from the need to conserve energy, partly from the growing awareness that the weather was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. What had begun as a crisp autumn morning was developing into something more ominous. Greta paused in her work, straightening her back with a grimace. "Look at those clouds," she muttered, pointing toward the peaks. "That's not an autumn shower coming our way." Lotte followed her gaze and felt her stomach tighten. The clouds building over the mountains were dark and heavy, moving with the kind of purposeful speed that spoke of serious weather. In the distance, she could see the first snow beginning to fall, and the wind that reached them carried the bite of winter rather than the gentle chill of late fall. "We should head back," Anna said, her voice tight with worry. She was the youngest of their group, barely 20, and still carried the fear of someone who'd learned too early that the world could change without warning. They were loading the last of the wood when the snow began in earnest. Not the gentle flakes of early winter, but the driving, wind-whipped precipitation that could bury landmarks and turn familiar paths into deadly mazes. Lotte pulled her coat tighter and reached for the cart's handle, but the wind nearly knocked her sideways. "Stay close," she called to the others, though her words were almost lost in the growing howl of the storm. The path back to camp, clear just an hour before, was already disappearing under a blanket of white. They made it perhaps halfway before the world disappeared entirely. The snow fell so thickly that Lotte couldn't see her own hands clearly, and the wind drove the flakes horizontal, stinging exposed skin and filling their eyes with tears that froze before they could fall. The cart became impossible to pull, its wheels clogged with snow and ice. "Leave it," Greta shouted, though she was only an arm's length away. "We have to find shelter." But shelter was a relative term in the wilderness. The camp was still miles away, invisible in the white chaos that had swallowed the world. Lotte's coat, adequate for autumn work, provided little protection against the wind that seemed to cut straight through to her bones. Her feet, already numb in boots designed more for durability than warmth, stumbled over obstacles hidden beneath the rapidly deepening snow. The three women huddled together, trying to use their combined body heat to stave off the cold that was seeping into their bones. Anna was already shivering uncontrollably, her lips taking on a blue tinge that Lotte recognized with professional alarm. They needed warmth, and they needed it soon. "There," Greta pointed through the storm toward what might have been a darker patch in the white. "Trees. At least we can get out of this wind." They stumbled toward the timber, supporting each other over ground that seemed to shift and change with each step. The snow was already ankle-deep and climbing, and Lotte's medical training told her they were fighting time as much as weather. Hypothermia was insidious. It crept in quietly, stealing warmth and judgment in equal measure until its victims made the kinds of decisions that ensured they'd never make another. The trees provided some relief from the wind, but the snow continued to fall with relentless determination. Lotte tried to orient herself, looking for landmarks that might indicate their position relative to the camp. Everything looked the same in the storm. White trees, white ground, white sky that pressed down like a heavy blanket. "I can't feel my hands," Anna whispered. And Lotte saw that the young woman was shaking badly now, her movements becoming clumsy and uncoordinated. "We need to keep moving," Lotte said, though she wasn't sure in which direction. Every path looked the same, and the snow was falling so heavily that their own footsteps disappeared within minutes. "Stay together. Hold on to each other." But as they pushed deeper into the timber, seeking better shelter, Lotte realized with growing horror that they were no longer following any path at all. They were lost, trapped in a wilderness that had suddenly become as hostile as any battlefield she'd ever seen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived bombs and artillery, field hospitals under enemy fire, only to find herself fighting for her life against Montana snow. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind showed no signs of relenting. Lotte's breath came in short puffs that froze almost instantly, and she could feel the dangerous lethargy of cold beginning to creep into her thoughts. They had to find shelter soon, or the mountains would claim 3 more casualties of a war that was supposed to be over. The storm struck with the fury of something personal, as if the mountains themselves had taken offense at the small figures struggling through their domain. Within minutes, what had been a manageable autumn snowfall transformed into a blizzard that erased the world beyond arm's reach. Lotte pressed forward, one hand gripping Anna's coat, the other reaching ahead to feel for obstacles in the white chaos. "We have to find shelter." Greta's voice barely carried over the wind's howl. The older woman was struggling. Her breathing labored and her movements increasingly unsteady. Inna had stopped shivering, which Lotte knew was a dangerous sign. Her body was shutting down, conserving heat for vital organs in a last desperate attempt at survival. They stumbled into a small clearing where the wind hit them with renewed force, driving snow into their faces like frozen needles. Lotte tried to orient herself, searching for any landmark that might guide them back toward camp, but the storm had swallowed everything familiar. Every direction looked the same. White trees emerging from white ground under a white sky that pressed down with suffocating weight. "I can't go any further," Anna whispered, her words slurred with cold. She sank to her knees in the snow, her young face pale as marble. "I'm so tired." Lotte knelt beside her, pulling the nursing kit from inside her coat. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing the medical supplies she'd carefully preserved. Bandages, antiseptic, surgical thread, and a small vial of stimulant that might help Anna's circulation. But what they needed wasn't medicine. It was warmth, shelter, and rescue. "Anna, listen to me," Lotte said, gripping the young woman's shoulders. "You cannot sleep here. Do you understand? If you sleep, you won't wake up." The girl nodded weakly, but her eyes were already taking on the glassy look that Lotte had seen too many times in field hospitals. Greta collapsed beside them, her face grey with exhaustion and cold. They were dying, all three of them, and there was nothing Lotte's medical training could do against the simple, brutal mathematics of hypothermia. She tried to think, to force her numbing mind to work through their options. They could try to build a shelter from pine boughs, but that would take time they didn't have and energy they'd already spent. They could continue searching for the camp, but in the storm, they were more likely to walk in circles until the cold claimed them. Or they could stay here, huddled together, and hope the storm passed before their bodies gave out. None of the choices led anywhere good. Lotte pulled the photograph of Klaus from her pocket, studying his young face through the plastic that protected it from moisture. Her brother had been caught in an alpine storm during the war, his unit trapped in the mountains for 3 days before rescue arrived. Half of them hadn't made it. Klaus had written about it in one of his last letters, how the cold became an enemy more relentless than any human opponent, how it stripped away everything but the raw will to survive. "I'm sorry, Klaus," she whispered to the photo. "I tried to keep going." The wind picked up again, driving snow so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Anna had stopped responding to her voice, and Greta was mumbling in German, words that made no sense. Lotte felt her own thoughts beginning to scatter, the dangerous confusion that preceded the final sleep. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats, muffled by snow but unmistakable. She tried to call out, but her voice was too weak to carry over the wind. The sound grew closer, and through the white curtain of snow, a dark shape emerged. Eli McBride materialized from the storm like something from a dream, sitting astride a large bay horse whose breath steamed in the frigid air. His face was weathered and stern beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his coat dark against the white chaos surrounding them. For a moment, Lotte wondered if she was hallucinating, if the cold had finally addled her brain enough to conjure rescue from desperation. But the horse was real, snorting and stamping in the snow, and the man looking down at them was solid flesh and blood. His eyes, pale blue and steady, took in their situation with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to emergencies. He dismounted without hesitation, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. "Jesus," he muttered, kneeling beside Anna. His hands, large and calloused, checked her pulse with surprising gentleness. "How long have you been out here?" "Since morning," Lotte managed through chattering teeth. "We were gathering firewood when the storm hit." "From the camp, the work camp." Eli's jaw tightened at the mention of the camp, and for a moment Lotte saw something hard flash in his eyes. She knew that look, the expression of a man who'd lost people to war and found it difficult to separate enemy from victim. But whatever internal struggle he faced lasted only seconds before pragmatism took over. "This one's in bad shape," he said, lifting Anna in his arms. The young woman's head lolled against his shoulder, unconscious now. The other one, too. "They need warmth, fast." He looked at Lotte, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. The cold had stolen too much, left her muscles cramped and useless. She was going to die here, she realized with strange calm. This stranger had come too late for her. "Can you ride?" Eli asked. Lotte tried to answer, but only a whisper emerged. He seemed to understand anyway, because he was suddenly beside her, his strong hands lifting her as easily as he'd lifted Anna. The warmth of his body through his coat was like fire against her frozen skin. "Up you go," he said, settling her onto his horse's saddle. The animal was large and steady, its warmth seeping through her clothing. Eli wrapped Anna in his own coat before lifting her up behind Lotte, then did the same with Greta. 3 people and supplies made for a heavy load, but the horse seemed equal to it. What surprised Lotte was that Eli didn't mount behind them. Instead, he took the reins and began walking alongside, leading them through the storm on foot. "Your horse," she protested weakly. "You should ride. Horse can carry 3, not 4, he replied without looking up. His voice was rough, practical. "My legs work fine." Through the storm, Lotte watched this stranger, this American who had every reason to leave them to the mercy of the mountains, trudge through snow that was already past his knees. Each step was deliberate, carefully placed, and she realized he was following a path invisible to her, reading signs in the landscape that the storm couldn't erase entirely. "Why?" she asked, when they'd ridden in silence for what felt like hours. "Why help us?" Eli glanced up at her, his face partly hidden by the brim of his hat. Snow had collected on his shoulders and in his beard, making him look like some mountain spirit, conjured by the storm. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said simply. But Lotte heard something else in his voice, a weariness that spoke of old grief, of choices made and regretted. She thought of the photograph in her pocket, of Klaus, who died trying to help wounded soldiers, regardless of which uniform they wore. Perhaps kindness was sometimes just stubbornness in disguise, a refusal to let the world's cruelty have the final word. The journey to his cabin took 2 hours that felt like days. Anna and Greta drifted in and out of consciousness, their bodies slack against Lotte's back. Eli never faltered, though she could see the effort each step cost him. Snow accumulated on the trail faster than they could travel, and the wind showed no mercy to anyone foolish enough to be caught in its path. When the cabin finally appeared through the storm, a solid, welcoming structure with smoke rising from its chimney, Lotte felt tears freeze on her cheeks. Not from cold, though she was colder than she'd ever been in her life, but from the simple relief of knowing they would live through the night. Eli helped them down from the horse with the same careful gentleness he'd shown throughout their journey. His face was red with cold, ice crystals clinging to his beard, but his hands remained steady as he carried Anna and Greta inside. The warmth of the cabin hit Lotte like a physical force, making her skin burn as circulation slowly returned. "Get them by the fire," Eli said, settling the unconscious women on a thick rug near the stone hearth. "But not too close. Heat them up slow, or you'll do more harm than good." Lotte nodded, her medical training taking over despite her own exhaustion. She checked pulses, monitored breathing, began the careful process of warming victims of severe hypothermia. Eli moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, heating water, gathering blankets and dry clothes, as feeling returned to her hands and feet, bringing with it waves of pain that made her gasp. Lotte studied the man who'd saved their lives. His cabin was simple but comfortable, handmade furniture, wool rugs, books on rough-hewn shelves. Everything spoke of a life lived deliberately, with attention to craftsmanship and care. It also spoke of solitude. There were no photographs on the walls, no feminine touches, nothing to suggest that anyone else shared this space. Yet something about the emptiness felt fresh, as if it hadn't always been this way. "Thank you," she said when Eli brought her a cup of hot coffee. Her voice was stronger now, though her hand still shook as she accepted the mug. He nodded but didn't meet her eyes. "Storm should blow through by morning. They'll get you back to your camp then." There was finality in his voice, a clear boundary being drawn. He'd done his Christian duty, saved 3 lives from the mountain's hunger, but that didn't mean he wanted anything more to do with them. Lotte understood. She was the enemy after all, or had been until recently. Some wounds took longer to heal than others, but as she sipped the coffee and felt life returning to her frozen body, she found herself studying Eli's weathered face in the firelight, wondering what losses had carved those lines around his eyes. Whatever they were, they taught him that kindness and distance could coexist, that a man could save a life without opening his heart. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin, 3 women breathed steady and warm. Sometimes Lotte thought survival was enough. Sometimes it was everything. Lotte woke to the sound of wind still howling outside the cabin walls, but the storm's fury had lessened during the night. Grey dawn light filtered through frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed by snow. She lay on a makeshift bed near the dying fire, wrapped in woolen blankets that smelled of cedar and honest work. Anna and Greta slept nearby, their breathing steady and strong. They would recover. Eli sat at a simple wooden table across the room, whittling something from a piece of pine. His movements were precise, economical, the product of hands that had shaped wood for decades. He'd changed from his snow-soaked clothes into clean flannel and denim, but dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd spent the night keeping watch over his unexpected guests. "How long was I sleeping?" Lotte asked, her voice still hoarse from the cold. 6 hours, maybe 7. He didn't look up from his carving. "Fever broke around midnight. You were talking in your sleep, German mostly, but some English." Heat rose in her cheeks. She wondered what she might have said, what memories the fever had dredged up from the depths where she kept them buried. "I'm sorry if Nothing to apologize for." His knife paused in its work. "You were asking for Klaus, brother?" The question was casual, but Lotte heard something beneath it, not curiosity exactly, but the careful attention of a man trying to understand who he'd brought into his home. She touched her coat pocket where the photograph rested, a reflexive gesture that didn't escape his notice. "My younger brother. He was a medic with the Wehrmacht." The words came easier than she'd expected. "Killed in Italy, 1944. Eli's hands stilled completely now. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind outside and the soft breathing of the sleeping women. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "Sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for yours." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She'd seen it in his face the night before, the particular grief of a parent who'd outlived his children. It was a wound that never truly healed, only scarred over until something touched it wrong and tore it open again. His knife resumed its steady work, shaving thin curls of wood that fell to the cabin floor. "Don't know what you're talking about." But his denial was too quick, too sharp. Lotte had spent enough time around grieving people to recognize the signs. The careful ordering of his space, the absence of personal items that might trigger memories, the way he held himself apart, even while offering help, all of it spoke to someone who'd learned that distance was safer than connection. As morning progressed, Anna and Greta stirred to consciousness. Both were weak but alert, their color returning as warmth seeped back into their bones. Eli made breakfast, eggs from chickens that somehow survived mountain winters, biscuits that were better than anything the camp kitchen produced. "Coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Eat slow," he advised when Anna tried to wolf down her food. "Your stomach needs time to remember what it's for." While her companions ate, Lotte explored the cabin with her eyes. It was larger than it had seemed in the firelight. 2 rooms connected by a stone hearth with a loft accessible by a handmade ladder. The furniture was simple but well crafted, each piece showing the attention to detail of someone who took pride in his work. Books lined shelves built into the walls, everything from practical manuals on animal husbandry to worn volumes of poetry. But it was what wasn't there that told the real story. No photographs on the walls, no feminine touches, no signs that children had ever played in these rooms. The cabin felt like a place where someone had carefully removed all traces of a former life, leaving only the essentials for survival. "Roads won't be passable for days," Eli said, following her gaze to the windows where snow continued to pile against the glass. "Storm like this, it'll take time to dig out. We can't impose on your hospitality," Greta said quickly. She was a proud woman, made uncomfortable by accepting charity from a stranger, especially one who'd had good reason to consider them enemies not long ago. "Wasn't offering hospitality," Eli replied matter-of-factly, "was stating a fact. You can't leave, so you're staying. Simple as that." While clearing the breakfast dishes, Lotte noticed something glinting in a corner behind the wood stove. Partially hidden by shadow was a dented Wehrmacht helmet, its distinctive shape unmistakable even in the dim light. The sight of it sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Eli saw her looking. "Found it buried near the cabin last spring, probably left by some POW work detail years back." His voice was carefully neutral, but his hands had stopped moving. "Figured someone might want it back someday." The helmet seemed to watch them from its corner, a reminder that the war's echoes reached even into these remote mountains. Lotte wondered how it had come to be here, whether its owner had been friend or enemy, whether he'd ever made it home. So many questions with no answers, so many stories buried under snow and time. "Klaus wore one just like it," she said quietly. "He used to joke that it made him look like a turtle. What kind of man was he?" The question surprised her, coming from Eli, who seemed determined to keep conversation practical and impersonal. Kind. Too kind for war, really. He wanted to be a doctor when it was over. Help people heal instead of watching them die. She touched the photograph in her pocket again. He saved Allied soldiers when he could. Said wounded was wounded no matter what uniform they wore. Something shifted in Eli's expression, not softening exactly, but a crack in the careful armor he wore. "Sounds like a good man." He was. The world's smaller without people like him in it. As the day wore on, the storm gradually exhausted itself. Snow still fell, but gently now, adding inches rather than feet to the accumulation. Eli ventured outside to check on his animals, returning with reports that the drifts were deep but manageable. More importantly, he'd spotted smoke rising from the direction of the camp. They'd weathered the storm and would likely send search parties once the roads cleared. Anna and Greta spent most of the day sleeping, their bodies still recovering from their brush with death. But Lotte found herself increasingly restless, her natural inclination to help warring with the awkwardness of being an uninvited guest. When she offered to help with chores, Eli initially refused, but the small space seemed to shrink with 4 people in it, and eventually he grudgingly accepted her assistance. She proved surprisingly capable. Her hands steady as she helped prepare meals and tend the fire. Years of camp life had taught her to make herself useful in any situation, and she approached each task with the quiet competence that had made her a good nurse. Eli watched her work with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile what he saw with what he'd expected. "You're not what I thought you'd be," he said, as they prepared dinner together. His first truly personal comment since rescuing them. "What did you think I'd be?" He was quiet for a long moment, stirring soup that smelled of herbs and root vegetables. "Harder, I guess. More bitter. After everything that happened, bitterness is a luxury I can't afford," she replied. "It takes too much energy, and I need all I have just to keep going." Outside, darkness was falling early, as it did in the mountains during winter. Inside the cabin, lamplight created a circle of warmth that seemed to hold the larger world at bay. For the first time since the war ended, Lotte felt something approaching peace, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of simple human kindness in a place where it wasn't expected. But she could see in Eli's careful movements, in the way he avoided meeting her eyes for too long, that he was fighting his own battle. Every gesture of hospitality seemed to cost him something, as if kindness were a finite resource he couldn't afford to spend freely. Whatever losses had brought him to this mountain solitude, they hadn't yet taught him how to let anyone close enough to matter. The second day dawned clear and bitter cold, with sunlight reflecting off snow so bright it hurt to look at directly. Eli checked the roads again and returned shaking his head. The drifts were too deep for safe travel, and more snow was forecast. They would be staying at least another day, maybe two. Lotte had been awake for an hour before dawn, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar space. She'd spent the time studying the cabin's details in the growing light, noting the careful craftsmanship in every joint and corner. This was a home built to last generations, yet it felt like a place where someone was simply marking time. "Can't sleep either." Eli's voice came from the other room, followed by the soft sounds of someone building up the fire. "I'm not used to being still," she admitted, rising from her makeshift bed. Anna and Greta were sleeping deeply, exhausted by their ordeal. "At the camp, there's always work to do, always something that needs fixing or cleaning. Know the feeling?" He appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day. "Come on. Might as well make some coffee if we're both awake." They worked together in comfortable silence, the routine of morning chores creating a temporary truce between strangers. Lotte found herself studying his movements, economical, practiced, the product of years spent living alone. Everything he did served a purpose, nothing wasted on flourish or show. "You built this place yourself," she observed, running her hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen table. "My grandfather started it. I finished it." He poured coffee into 2 heavy mugs. "Took me 15 years to get it right. Kept finding things that needed improving. It's beautiful work, work's work. Beautiful's just what happens when you take time to do it right." After breakfast, Lotte insisted on helping with the morning chores despite Eli's protests. She followed him to the barn, where his livestock waited. 3 cows, a handful of chickens, and the bay horse that had carried them to safety. The animals seemed well cared for, their quarters clean and warm despite the bitter weather outside. "How do you manage all this alone?" she asked, watching him milk with practiced efficiency. "Same way you do anything. One day at a time." He paused in his work. "Though I'll admit it was easier when—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "When you had help." The question was gentle, but she saw him withdraw at the words. "When things were different," he said finally. Later, while Eli chopped wood outside, Lotte took the opportunity to explore the cabin more thoroughly. She'd offered to tidy up, old habits from nursing, where maintaining order could mean the difference between life and death, and he'd grudgingly agreed. In a wooden crate beneath the window, she found a bundle of letters tied with string. The return addresses were military, APO numbers and unit designations that spoke of mail from overseas. Her hands trembled as she recognized the careful script on the envelopes, letters from sons to their father, written from places whose names had become synonymous with sacrifice. She shouldn't read them. They were private, intimate, meant for one man's eyes only. But the top letter had come partially unfolded, and she caught glimpses of words that made her breath catch. "Proud to be your son," and "Tell Mom not to worry," and "When this is over, we'll work the ranch together." The letters were from Thomas and Samuel, Eli's boys, the ones whose names were carved on the wooden cross by his bedside. Dozens of them, chronicling a war from the perspective of young men trying to reassure a father they might never see again. The dates ran from 1942 to early 1944, then stopped abruptly. Lotte carefully retied the bundle, her hands shaking with more than just the cold. She understood now why the cabin felt like a tomb, why Eli moved through it like a man walking through his own past. This had been a family home once, filled with the voices and dreams of people who'd believed in tomorrow. Now it was a monument to loss, preserved exactly as it had been when hope died. "Find what you were looking for." Eli's voice from the doorway made her jump. "I wasn't looking for anything. I was just cleaning." His tone was flat, dangerous. "That include reading other people's mail?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "I'm sorry. One of the letters had come undone, and I saw—" "You saw names, dates. Things that aren't your business. I saw pain, she said quietly. The same pain I carry for Klaus. I wasn't prying, Eli. I was recognizing. For a moment, she thought he might order her out of the cabin, storm or no storm. The muscles in his jaw worked as he struggled with something. Anger, grief. The violation of having his carefully guarded privacy breached by a stranger. Instead, he walked to the crate and lifted out the bundle of letters. His hands, so steady with every other task, shook slightly as he held them. Thomas was 22 when he wrote the last one. Sam was 24. His voice was carefully controlled, each word measured. They were good boys. Better men than their father ever was. I'm sure they were proud to be your sons. They shouldn't have had to die for other people's mistakes. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Shouldn't have had to fix what the adults broke. Lotte thought of Klaus, of all the young men who'd been fed to the machinery of war. None of them should have. But they did their duty anyway, because that's who they were. That's who you raised them to be. My duty, Eli said, his laugh harsh. I sent my boys to die for duty. Told them it was right and honorable to march off and get killed by people they'd never met. You sent them to defend what they loved. Their country, their family, their future. Klaus felt the same way. He died trying to save people, not kill them. Eli was quiet for a long time, staring at the letters in his hands. Outside, the sound of chopping wood had stopped, and Lotte realized Anna or Greta must have taken over the task. The cabin felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of shared grief was pressing in on them. I haven't talked about them, he said finally. Not to anyone. Not since the telegrams came. Sometimes talking makes it worse before it makes it better, and sometimes it just makes it worse. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer the kind of comfort that came from human contact. But she could see how carefully he held himself apart, how much effort it took just to share this much. Instead, she continued her cleaning, giving him space to process whatever the conversation had stirred up. When Anna and Greta returned from outside, their cheeks red with cold and exertion, they found Eli and Lotte working together to prepare lunch. The atmosphere was different, heavier somehow, but also more honest. Some barrier had been crossed, though neither seemed entirely comfortable with what lay on the other side. The snow's beautiful, Anna said, warming her hands by the fire. I've never seen anything like it. Back home, winter was grey and harsh. This is like being inside a fairy tale. Eli glanced at her, something almost like amusement flickering in his eyes. Pretty enough to look at. Less pretty when you're trying to keep livestock alive through it. As afternoon faded toward evening, Lotte found herself increasingly aware of the dynamic between them, the careful dance of two people drawn together by circumstance but separated by history. Every conversation contained layers, every gesture was measured against the weight of what they'd both lost. But there was something else building too, something that made her pulse quicken when their hands accidentally touched passing dishes, something that made her hyper-aware of his presence even when he was across the room. It was dangerous territory for a woman in her position, attraction to a man who had every reason to see her as the enemy. Yet when their eyes met across the dinner table, she saw not hatred but a matching awareness, as if he were fighting the same unexpected battle between past and present, between what should be and what might be possible in the warm circle of lamplight that held the larger world at bay. The third morning brought with it a visitor that changed everything. Lotte woke to the sound of horses approaching the cabin, their hooves crunching through snow that had crusted over during the night. Through the frost-covered window, she could see 3 riders picking their way carefully up the trail, men in heavy coats with the purposeful movement of an official search party. Eli was already at the door, his face grim as he watched them approach. "They're camp officials," he said quietly. "Come looking for their missing workers." Lotte's stomach tightened. She'd known this moment would come, but 3 days in the cabin's warmth had made it easy to forget the reality waiting outside. She was property of the United States government, assigned to the work camp until such time as they decided what to do with former enemies who could never go home. "Girls," she said, shaking Anna and Greta awake. "Get dressed quickly. We have company. The lead rider dismounted at the cabin door, Sergeant Morrison from the camp, his weathered face showing relief mixed with something harder to read. Behind him came two younger men Lotte didn't recognize, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips. "Mr. McBride," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat. "You might have found our missing work detail." "Found 3 women half frozen in the storm," Eli replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Gave them shelter until the roads cleared. Appreciate that. We were worried we'd be digging bodies out of snowdrifts come spring." Morrison's eyes moved past Eli to where Lotte stood with Anna and Greta. "You ladies all right? Any injuries?" "We're fine," Lotte answered. "Mr. McBride saved our lives. We would have died without his help, I'm sure." Morrison stepped inside without invitation, his eyes taking in the cabin's details with professional interest. "Cozy setup you got here, McBride. Must get lonely, though, way up here by yourself." There was something in the sergeant's tone that made Lotte uneasy, an undertone of suspicion that seemed out of place given the circumstances. Eli noticed it too. She could see the tension in his shoulders as he faced the 3 armed men. "Lonely's a choice," Eli said. "Some of us prefer our own company. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with helping folks in trouble either." Morrison walked slowly around the cabin's main room, his gaze lingering on details. The comfortable seating arrangement by the fire, the remnants of breakfast for 4, the careful way Lotte and Eli positioned themselves in relation to each other. Though some might wonder about a man keeping 3 German women in his cabin for 3 days running, the implication hung in the air like smoke, ugly and inescapable. Lotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger at the suggestion that Eli's decency might mask something sordid. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. "Mr. McBride has been nothing but honorable. He gave us shelter when we would have died, asked for nothing in return, and treated us with more kindness than we had any right to expect. I'm sure he did." Morrison's smile was thin, patronizing. "Thing is, Miss Schneider, you're not exactly in a position to make character judgments about American citizens. Your job is to work where you're told and follow orders. Nothing more. That's enough." Eli's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You came for your workers. You found them alive and well. Time to move along." "Actually," Morrison said, "we need to have a conversation about this situation. See, when government property goes missing, there's paperwork to be filed, questions to be answered, especially when that property turns up in the private residence of a civilian. Government property." Eli's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Those are human beings you're talking about. Human beings with a specific legal status. They're enemy nationals held under the authority of the War Department. When they disappear for 3 days, folks start wondering if maybe someone's been harboring fugitives." The accusation was absurd. Lotte and the others had been trapped by weather, not attempting escape. But she could see the logic from Morrison's perspective. 3 German women, alone with an American man for multiple days, with no witnesses to verify what had actually transpired. In the suspicious climate of post-war America, even rescue could be made to look like collaboration. "You suggesting I'm some kind of sympathizer?" Eli's hands had curled into fists, and Lotte saw decades of mountain-hardened muscle beneath his flannel shirt. "You questioning my loyalty to this country?" "I'm not suggesting anything. Just doing my job, making sure everything's on the up and up." One of the younger men stepped forward, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Maybe we should search the place, Sergeant. Make sure nothing inappropriate happened." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Lotte could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, could see Eli calculating odds and distances with the cold assessment of a man who'd lived through enough conflicts to know when words stopped working. "Sergeant," she said quickly, "if you're concerned about our treatment, you can examine us. I'm a trained nurse. I know what to look for. We can settle this matter medically if necessary." Morrison considered this, his eyes moving between Lotte and Eli. That might be wise. "Private Kowalski here has some medical training. He could conduct examinations." "Like hell," Eli said, the words quiet but carrying absolute finality. Nobody's examining anybody in my home without proper cause and proper authorization. The authority comes from Washington, McBride. These women are enemy aliens. We don't need your permission to... You need my permission to do anything on my property. Eli moved to the gun rack on the wall, not reaching for a weapon, but making his proximity to them clear. And I'm not giving it. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. 4 armed men and 3 women trapped in a space suddenly too small to contain the tensions building inside it. Lotte realized that Eli was willing to fight for their dignity, possibly willing to die for it. And the knowledge sent something warm and frightening through her chest. There's no need for this to escalate, she said, stepping between the men. Sergeant Morrison, you found us alive and unharmed. Mr. McBride has committed no crime, quite the opposite. He saved 3 lives and asked for nothing in return. Surely that's worth noting in your report. Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're right, Miss Schneider. It is worth noting. He turned to Eli. Mr. McBride, on behalf of the United States Army, I thank you for your assistance in recovering valuable personnel. Your actions will be documented appropriately. The formal language was meant to close the matter, but Lotte heard the warning underneath. Eli would be watched now, his actions scrutinized by men who saw enemy sympathizers in every shadow. His simple act of decency had marked him as potentially dangerous to people who couldn't imagine kindness without ulterior motive. Time to go, ladies, Morrison said. Transport's waiting at the bottom of the trail. As they gathered their few belongings, Lotte found herself reluctant to leave the cabin's warmth for the uncertain future waiting outside. 3 days of human connection, of conversation and shared labor and the simple pleasure of being treated as something more than a number in a government file. It felt like waking from a good dream to find the world still, grey and cold. Eli helped them into their coats with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout their stay. When he handed Lotte her gloves, their fingers touched briefly, and she felt something pass between them. Not just attraction, though that was there, but recognition. They were both exiles in their own ways, both carrying losses that couldn't be shared with just anyone. Thank you, she said. The words inadequate for everything he'd given them. Take care of yourself, he replied. And she heard in his voice the same reluctance she felt, the same sense that something important was ending before it had really begun. The return to camp felt like stepping backward through time. After 3 days of warmth and human kindness, the barracks seemed smaller, colder, more oppressive than Lotte remembered. The other women greeted their return with relief mixed with curiosity. Where had they been? What had happened? Why did the 3 of them look different somehow? Lotte found it difficult to explain. How could she describe the feeling of being treated as a person rather than a problem? How could she convey the simple pleasure of conversation that wasn't monitored, of work that felt meaningful, of a man who'd risked his own reputation to save their lives? You were lucky, said Marie, one of the older women who'd been at the camp since its opening. Mountain storms kill people. Could have been your bodies they found come spring. We were very lucky, Lotte agreed, but the word felt insufficient. Luck was finding shelter in a cave or stumbling across an abandoned cabin. What they'd experienced was something else entirely, an act of deliberate kindness that had no basis in luck at all. The routine of camp life reasserted itself with grinding efficiency. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals that tasted like cardboard after Eli's cooking. Lotte threw herself into her tasks with renewed energy, but found her mind wandering to the cabin in the mountains, to conversations by firelight and the sound of wood being split with practiced precision. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Sergeant Morrison handed it to her personally, his expression unreadable as he watched her examine the envelope. No return address. But she recognized the careful script immediately. The same handwriting she'd seen on shopping lists and work notes scattered around Eli's cabin. Personal correspondence requires review, Morrison said, holding out his hand.
Security protocols. Lotte's heart sank, but she handed over the unopened letter.
The thought of Morrison reading Eli's private words, whatever they might contain, felt like a violation of something precious. But she had no choice. Enemy nationals had no expectation of privacy, no rights that couldn't be suspended for the greater good. The letter was returned to her 2 hours later, the envelope carefully resealed but obviously opened. Morrison said nothing as he handed it back, but his expression suggested the contents had been deemed harmless enough to pass along. Inside, she found 2 items, a brief note and a pressed wildflower, purple and delicate despite being dried. The note was characteristically practical. Thought you might like to know. Roads are clear now, animals doing well, cabins quiet again. Hope you're staying warm. E. The flower had no explanation, but Lotte understood its significance. She'd admired the patch of late-blooming wildflowers near his cabin, mentioning how they reminded her of the alpine flowers Klaus used to pick for their mother. Eli had listened, remembered, and found a way to send her a piece of beauty in a place where beauty was scarce. She kept both items hidden beneath her mattress next to her nursing kit and Klaus's photograph. Small treasures in a life largely stripped of personal possessions. They became touchstones she could return to when the weight of camp life grew too heavy. More letters followed, arriving every few days with clockwork regularity. Always brief, always practical on the surface, but layered with meaning that grew clearer as she learned to read between the lines. He wrote about weather and wildlife, about repairs to his cabin and changes in the seasons. But beneath the surface, she heard loneliness and an unexpected warmth that made her pulse quicken each time Morrison handed her another envelope. Popular correspondent, Morrison observed after the 5th letter arrived. Mr. McBride seems to have taken quite an interest in your welfare. He's a kind man, Lotte replied carefully. He feels responsible for our safety. Responsible, Morrison repeated the word, as if tasting something bitter. Interesting choice of words. Makes a man wonder what kind of responsibility he feels exactly. The implication was clear, and Lotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. In Morrison's worldview, apparently, no American man could show kindness to a German woman without ulterior motives. The possibility that Eli might simply be a decent human being seemed beyond his comprehension. After 2 weeks of letters, Lotte gathered her courage and asked Morrison for permission to write a response. The request was denied without explanation, but she saw the answer in his cold smile. Communication was a privilege, not a right, and one that could be revoked at any time. Still, the letters continued to arrive, becoming a lifeline to a world beyond the camp's fences. Through Eli's careful words, she learned about the rhythm of mountain life, the way snow changed the landscape, the challenges of keeping livestock fed through winter, the profound silence that settled over everything when storms passed through. But it was the personal details that meant the most. Brief mentions of memories triggered by something he'd seen or done, references to conversations they'd shared during those 3 days. Small jokes that proved he'd been listening, really listening, when she'd talked about her life before the war. The coffee's never quite right, he wrote in one letter. Keeps coming out too weak or too strong. Beginning to think it needs a nurse's touch to get the proportions right. Reading those words, Lotte could picture him in his kitchen, making coffee for one, and remembering how she'd helped him prepare meals for 4. The image filled her with an ache that was equal parts longing and impossibility. He was reaching across the divide that separated them. But that divide remained as real as the fences surrounding her. The other women began to notice the change in her. Enna, especially, watched with the keen eyes of someone young enough to recognize the signs of a woman falling in love, despite impossible circumstances. He's thinking about you, Anna said one evening as they prepared for sleep. The mountain man. You can see it in how you hold yourself when his letters come. Don't be ridiculous, Lotte replied, but her protest lacked conviction. He's just being kind to people who were guests in his home. Kind is bringing firewood. This is something else. Anna's voice was gentle, understanding. The question is, what are you going to do about it? It was a question Lotte had been avoiding, But Anna's words forced her to confront the truth she'd been denying. Something had happened in that cabin, something that went beyond gratitude for rescue or simple human compassion. In 3 days of forced proximity, 2 damaged people had found something in each other that neither had expected to discover again. But what could she do? She was a prisoner, he was a free man. She was German, he was American. She had lost everything, he had lost everything. They were both broken people, trying to survive in a world that had no place for the kind of connection they'd found. The letters were all they could have, all they would ever have. Yet somehow, reading his careful words by lamplight in the barracks, she felt less alone than she had in years. Whatever this was between them, friendship, understanding, or something deeper, it was real enough to sustain her through the long winter nights when hope seemed as distant as the mountain peaks visible through the camp's fence. Outside, snow began to fall again, and Lotte pressed her face to the cold window, wondering if the same snow was falling on Eli's cabin, if he was watching it accumulate, and thinking of 3 women who'd briefly made his home feel less empty. In her pocket, the pressed wildflower crumbled a little more each time she touched it, but its meaning remained intact, proof that beauty could survive in the most unlikely places, that kindness could bridge even the deepest divides, and that sometimes the most profound connections came from the most unexpected sources. The envelope that arrived on a grey December morning was different from the others, thicker, heavier, with an official seal that made Lotte's stomach clench before she even saw the contents. Morrison handed it to her with unusual gravity, his weathered face showing something that might have been sympathy. "This one comes from Washington," he said quietly. "Might want to sit down before you read it." Lotte's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, expecting news of repatriation or transfer to another camp. Instead, she found documents that made her read the same lines over and over, unable to process what they meant. The first sheet was a military record, complete service history for Private Thomas McBride, 101st Airborne Division. Wounded in action during the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Listed as missing in action, presumed dead after his unit was overrun during the German counter-offensive. The date and location matched her memories with sickening precision. The second sheet detailed Private Samuel McBride, 82nd Airborne Division. Killed in action during Operation Market Garden. September 1944, his body had been recovered and identified. Through dental records 3 months after the battle. Ended, but it was the third document that made the world tilt sideways beneath her feet. A medical report from a field hospital near Bastogne, dated December 23, 1944. The patient was listed as an unidentified American paratrooper, wounded and unconscious, suffering from severe head trauma and exposure. The attending physician had been Lotte Schneider, Wehrmacht Medical Corps, attached to a prisoner of war collection point behind German lines. According to the report, Klaus had worked for 6 hours to stabilize the wounded American, performing emergency surgery with limited supplies under combat conditions. The patient had survived long enough to be evacuated to a German military hospital, where he'd been listed among prisoners of war held for eventual exchange. The final document was a post-war interview with Private Thomas McBride, conducted after his liberation from a German prison camp in May 1945. In halting words, he described being wounded during the attack on Bastogne, losing consciousness, and waking up in a German field hospital where a young medic had saved his life. "He could have let me die," the transcript read. Nobody would have blamed him. "But he worked on me like I was his own brother. Never got his name, but I'll never forget his face. Thomas McBride, Eli's son." Saved by Lotte Schneider. Her brother Lotte read the documents 3 times before their full meaning sank in. The War Department, in its methodical way, had been tracking down connections between American personnel and German medical staff who treated them. Klaus's name had appeared in multiple reports. Allied soldiers who credited him with saving their lives. Testimony about his refusal to distinguish between friend and enemy when it came to providing medical care. Someone in Washington had made the connection between Klaus Schneider and Lotte Schneider, then cross-referenced that with reports about the German work detail rescued by one Eli McBride. The coincidence had been deemed significant enough to warrant investigation, and the investigation had revealed a truth that changed everything. Eli's son was alive because Klaus had died saving Allied soldiers. The letter that accompanied the documents was from a Colonel Harrison in the War Department's Personnel Recovery Division. Written in the dry language of official correspondence, it nonetheless conveyed something approaching wonder at the interconnected nature of the story it told. Miss Schneider, it concluded, the United States Army recognizes the extraordinary service performed by your brother in saving American lives, often at considerable personal risk. While we cannot restore what the war has taken from either of our families, we hope this information provides some measure of comfort in understanding that Private Thomas McBride survived to return home because of your brother's courage and skill. But Thomas McBride hadn't returned home. He died in that prison camp 3 months before liberation, succumbing to injuries that even Klaus's skill couldn't fully heal. The irony was devastating. Klaus had saved a life that was ultimately lost anyway, had died himself trying to preserve something that couldn't be preserved. Lotte sat in the barracks for hours, holding the documents and trying to process their implications. She thought of Eli's careful letters, his gradual warming toward her, the way he'd risked his reputation to shelter 3 German women during a storm. Had he known? Had he suspected some connection that went deeper than chance encounter? The possibility that he'd acted out of some sense of obligation rather than genuine feeling made her stomach turn. Everything they'd shared, every moment of connection she'd treasured, suddenly felt suspect. Had his kindness been payment of a debt rather than recognition of shared humanity? That evening, Morrison approached her with another envelope, this one bearing Eli's familiar handwriting. But unlike his previous letters, this one had been opened and resealed multiple times, suggesting extensive review by camp officials. Thought you might want to read this, Morrison said, his tone unusually gentle. Came in the same batch as your other mail. Inside, she found the longest letter Eli had ever written, his careful script covering 3 full pages. The opening lines made her heart sink. I know about Klaus. Got a visit from Army investigators yesterday, asking questions about my son Thomas and his time as a prisoner of war. They showed me medical records, told me about a German medic who saved his life. Didn't take long to put the pieces together, but as she read further, her despair transformed into something else entirely. Eli's words weren't those of a man fulfilling an obligation, but of someone struggling to understand how fate had woven their lives together in ways neither could have imagined. I've been thinking about what it means, he wrote, that your brother saved my boy, even though it couldn't save either of them in the end. Klaus didn't know Thomas was my son when he operated on him. Thomas didn't know Klaus was your brother when he told me about the German medic who wouldn't let him die. They were just 2 young men caught up in something bigger than both of them, trying to do right by each other despite everything the world told them they should be. The letter went on to describe Eli's struggle with the revelation. His initial anger at learning his rescuer had been connected to him by bonds of debt and gratitude he'd never known existed. But somewhere in his wrestling with the truth, he'd found something else, not obligation, but a deeper understanding of the forces that had brought them together. I didn't help you because of what Klaus did for Thomas, he wrote. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. But knowing what I know now, I understand that rightness isn't just about the moment we're in. It's about honoring the people who came before us, the choices they made when everything was falling apart. The final paragraph made her eyes burn with unshed tears. Your brother saved my son's life. My son died anyway in a place far from home, probably scared and missing his family. Klaus died too, probably the same way. But for a few months, because of what Klaus did, Thomas got to hope he might see Montana again. He got to write letters home. He got to believe in tomorrow. That's not nothing, Lotte, that's everything. Lotte folded the letter carefully, adding it to the small collection she kept hidden beneath her mattress. But this one felt different from the others, heavier with meaning, weighted with the recognition that their connection hadn't been chance at all, but the latest chapter in a story that had begun in the chaos of a Belgian winter and would continue long after both of them were gone. Outside, snow was falling again, covering the camp in the same white silence that had brought them together. But now she understood that silence differently, not as emptiness but as the space between stories. The pause between one chapter ending and another beginning. Klaus and Thomas were gone, their young lives cut short by a war that had devoured an entire generation. But their choices, their moment of shared humanity in the midst of inhumanity, had created something that outlasted both of them. In saving Thomas, Klaus had planted seeds that would bloom years later in a Montana cabin. In 3 women given shelter by a man who understood that kindness was the only response to a world that had forgotten how to be kind. The revelation changed nothing and everything. Lotte was still a prisoner. Eli was still alone in his mountains, and the distance between them remained as vast as ever. But now that distance was bridged by something stronger than attraction or even love. It was bridged by the recognition that some connections transcended time and circumstance, that the best of human nature could survive even the worst of human actions. In her pocket, the pressed wildflower had crumbled to dust, but its meaning had grown into something larger than symbol. It had become proof that beauty and kindness could bloom anywhere, that the sons and brothers lost to war could still speak through the choices made by those who survived them, and that sometimes the most profound love stories were written not in romance, but in the simple decision to see the humanity in one's supposed enemies. The news came on a bitter January morning, when frost covered the barracks' windows like lace, and the coffee froze in their cups before they could drink it. Sergeant Morrison gathered the women in the mess hall with unusual formality, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man about to deliver information he'd rather keep to himself. "Ladies," he began, his breath visible in the unheated building, "I've received orders from Washington regarding the disposition of this facility. The Clearwater Work Camp will be decommissioned. Effective March 1st, all personnel will be transferred 2 other locations for final processing before repatriation." The words hit Lotte like a physical blow. Repatriation, return to Germany, to a homeland that existed now only in memory, bombed flat and occupied by the same forces that had once pursued her across European battlefields. After 2.5 years in Montana, the thought of leaving felt like dying twice. "Where will we go?" asked Marie, her voice thin with fear. At 62, she was the oldest among them, and the prospect of starting over in a devastated country seemed beyond her remaining strength. "That's still being determined," Morrison replied. "Some of you may be eligible for voluntary repatriation to American relatives or sponsors. Others will return to the occupation zones in Germany for further processing." Voluntary repatriation. Lotte's mind seized on the phrase. It meant the possibility of staying in America, of building a life in the country that had first held her prisoner, and then, through Eli's kindness, shown her what home might feel like again. But it required an American citizen to vouch for her, to take legal responsibility for her integration into society. She thought immediately of Eli, then forced the thought away. He was a single man living alone in the mountains. The government would never approve such an arrangement, and asking him to take on such a burden would be unfair to someone who'd already done more for her than duty or decency required. Still, the possibility gnawed at her as the days passed. Letters from Eli continued to arrive with regular precision, but their tone had changed since the revelation about Klaus and Thomas. Where once he'd written about daily life and practical matters, now his words carried a weight of unfinished business, of things that needed to be said before time ran out. "Spring comes early to the high country," he wrote in late January. Snow's starting to melt on the south-facing slopes, and I can hear water running underneath the ice. Makes a man think about changes coming, whether he's ready for them or not. Reading between the lines had become second nature to Lotte. Eli was preparing for something, making plans that involved more than just seasonal transitions. But what those plans might be, she couldn't guess. The answer came in February, delivered not by letter, but by Eli himself. Lotte was hanging laundry on lines stretched between the barracks when she saw him riding up the camp's main road, his bay horse picking its way carefully through patches of ice and mud. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him dismount at the administrative office. His movements carrying the purposeful determination of a man who'd made a difficult decision and meant to see it through. She forced herself to continue with her work, hanging shirts and undergarments with hands that trembled despite the cold. Other women had noticed the rider and were whispering among themselves, recognizing him as the mountain man who'd rescued 3 of their number from the storm. Anna appeared at Lotte's elbow, her young face bright with curiosity and hope. "He's here for you," she said, with the certainty of someone who'd read too many romantic novels. "Look at how he sits that horse, like a man on a mission." "Don't be foolish," Lotte replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "He's probably here on business with the camp administration." But when Morrison emerged from his office an hour later and walked directly toward her, she knew Anna had been right. The sergeant's expression was carefully neutral, but she caught something in his eyes that might have been approval mixed with amazement. "Miss Schneider," he said formally, "you're requested in the administration office. You have a visitor." The walk across the compound felt endless, every step watched by 42 pairs of eyes that understood the significance of what was happening, even if they couldn't guess the details. Lotte's legs felt unsteady beneath her, and she had to concentrate on breathing as Morrison opened the office door and gestured her inside. Eli stood with his back to the door, studying a map of Montana that hung on the wall behind Morrison's desk. He'd dressed carefully for this visit. Clean shirt, pressed trousers, boots polished to a shine that spoke of respect for the occasion's importance. When he turned to face her, she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerability, mixed with determination. "Like a man stepping off a cliff and hoping he could fly." "Miss Schneider," Morrison said, settling behind his desk with the air of a man about to conduct important business. "Mr. McBride has come here today to discuss your situation regarding the camp's closure." Eli cleared his throat, his hands working the brim of his hat in a gesture that betrayed his nervousness. "I've been thinking about what you said in your letters," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "No, that's not right. I've been thinking about a lot of things. About Klaus and Thomas. About debts that can't be repaid and connections that go deeper than circumstance." He paused, gathering himself, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the steady cadence of a man who'd rehearsed these words but meant every one of them. "I've filed a petition with the War Department to serve as your sponsor for voluntary repatriation. I'm prepared to take legal responsibility for your integration into American society, to provide housing and employment until such time as you can establish yourself independently." The words hit Lotte like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread through every corner of her consciousness. Sponsorship meant freedom, meant the chance to build a life in America instead of returning to a Germany that no longer existed. But it also meant binding herself to Eli in ways that went far beyond the tentative connection they'd built through letters and shared memories. "Mr. McBride," Morrison interjected, "I'm required to inform you that sponsorship carries significant legal obligations. You would be responsible for Miss Schneider's actions, her financial support, her housing and employment. Any violations of law or immigration requirements would reflect directly on your record as a citizen." "I understand," Eli replied without taking his eyes off Lotte. "I've read the regulations. I know what I'm asking for. And you, Miss Schneider," Morrison continued, "need to understand that accepting sponsorship means accepting a form of supervised freedom. You would be required to report regularly to immigration authorities, to maintain steady employment, to demonstrate successful integration into American society. Any failure to meet these requirements could result in immediate deportation. Lotte nodded, though her mind was reeling with the implications of what was being offered. Freedom, but at the cost of binding herself to a man she barely knew, despite the connection they'd forged through crisis and correspondence. It was a leap of faith that required trusting not just Eli's intentions, but her own ability to build a life in a country that had been enemy territory just 3 years before. "I need to ask," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "why you're doing this. Is it because of Klaus? Because you feel obligated by what he did for Thomas?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying her face with the intensity of a man trying to read weather signs in a changeable sky. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of truth that couldn't be argued with. Klaus saving Thomas was the beginning, not the reason. It brought us together, but it doesn't define what happens next. He paused, seeming to search for words that could encompass everything he felt. These past months, reading your letters, thinking about our conversations in the cabin, you've reminded me that life doesn't end when the worst thing happens, that there's still room for connection, for building something new from the pieces that are left. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the hope he was trying so hard to contain. "I'm not offering charity or obligation, Lotte. I'm offering partnership. A chance for both of us to stop just surviving and start living again. But only if that's what you want, too." The offer hung between them like bridge across an impossible chasm, substantial enough to cross, but requiring courage neither could be certain they possessed. Outside, the Montana winter was beginning its slow retreat, ice breaking up on streams that had been frozen for months. Inside the stuffy administrative office, 2 damaged people faced the possibility of healing together, of turning shared loss into shared hope. Lotte thought of Klaus, of the choice he'd made to save an enemy soldier because healing was more important than hatred. She thought of Thomas, dying far from home, but sustained by the knowledge that kindness existed even in the darkest places. She thought of the pressed wildflower that had crumbled to dust in her pocket, its meaning outlasting its physical form. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with surprising strength. "Yes, I want that too." Morrison reached for the paperwork that would transform her from prisoner to sponsored immigrant, from enemy national to woman with a future. But Lotte's eyes remained fixed on Eli's face, reading in his expression the same mixture of hope and terror she felt in her own chest. They were about to discover whether love could grow from the soil of shared loss, whether 2 people broken by the same war could help each other remember how to be whole. The immigration hearing took place in a sterile government building in Missoula, its fluorescent lights harsh against the gray February morning. Lotte sat in a wooden chair that had been designed for discomfort, her hands folded in her lap as 3 officials reviewed the documents that would determine her fate. Behind her, Eli waited with the patience of a man accustomed to letting bureaucrats take their time. "Miss Schneider," the lead examiner began, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who spoke in the clipped tones of someone who'd conducted 1,000 such interviews. "Your sponsor has filed a petition for voluntary repatriation, but there are several concerns that must be addressed before we can approve this arrangement." Lotte's stomach tightened. She'd known this wouldn't be simple. Former enemy nationals weren't typically welcomed with open arms, even those who'd committed no crimes beyond being born on the wrong side of a war they hadn't chosen. "First," the examiner continued, consulting his notes, "there's the matter of Mr. McBride's suitability as a sponsor. He's a single man with no previous experience supervising immigrant integration. The arrangement you're proposing is unconventional." The word carried implications that made Lotte's cheeks burn. She could read between the lines. A single woman living with a single man in an isolated mountain cabin violated every social convention of proper American society. That they were essentially strangers connected only by wartime tragedy and 3 days of shared shelter, made the arrangement seem even more suspect. "Mr. McBride," the examiner addressed Eli directly, "can you explain your motivation for taking on this responsibility? What assurances can you provide that this arrangement serves legitimate purposes?" Eli stood slowly, his hat in his hands, and Lotte heard in his careful breathing the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the steady cadence of a man who'd spent sleepless nights preparing for this question. "Miss Schneider's brother saved my son's life during the war. Klaus Schneider performed surgery on Thomas McBride under enemy fire, with limited supplies, asking for nothing in return except the chance to preserve a human life. My boy died anyway, months later in a prison camp, but Klaus gave him hope when everything looked hopeless." The examiner's pen scratched across paper as he made notes. "And you see sponsoring his sister as repaying that debt?" "No, sir." Eli's response was immediate, firm. "I see it as honoring what Klaus and Thomas both believed, that we're obligated to help each other survive, regardless of the uniforms we wear or the countries we come from. Miss Schneider is a trained nurse, a skilled worker, and a woman of strong moral character. America needs people like her." "Nevertheless," the second examiner interjected, a gray-haired woman with skeptical eyes, "the proposed living arrangement raises questions. You're asking us to release a foreign national into the custody of a man she barely knows, in an isolated location with minimal supervision. How do we ensure proper oversight of her integration process?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Lotte felt the careful structure of their petition beginning to crumble under bureaucratic suspicion. The officials saw only the surface, a questionable arrangement between strangers that violated social norms and defied easy categorization. "I have a proposal," Lotte said, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising strength. All three examiners turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. This was her moment to speak for herself, to demonstrate that she was more than a problem to be solved or a responsibility to be managed. "Dr. Margaret Hartwell runs a medical clinic in Cedar Falls, 20 miles from Mr. McBride's ranch. I've arranged to work for her as a nursing assistant, pending approval of my residency status. She's provided documentation of my medical training and a letter of employment offer." She reached into her coat and produced the papers she'd kept hidden until this moment. Documents she'd arranged through careful correspondence. Proof that she wasn't asking to disappear into mountain isolation, but to contribute meaningfully to an American community. "Additionally," she continued, "I've identified a boarding house in town where I can maintain residence while establishing myself professionally. Mr. McBride's sponsorship provides legal backing and financial security. But I don't intend to be dependent on his charity indefinitely." The lead examiner studied the new documents with obvious surprise. Whatever he'd expected from this interview, it wasn't a former enemy national who'd taken initiative to solve the problems he'd been prepared to identify. "Dr. Hartwell's clinic has been understaffed since the war ended," Lotte pressed on. "She needs someone with surgical experience and trauma training. My credentials have been verified through Red Cross records, and she's willing to provide supervision for my transition to American medical practice." Silence stretched through the room as the three officials exchanged glances, communicating in the shorthand of bureaucrats who'd worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. Lotte felt Eli's presence behind her like an anchor, steady and reassuring, even as her own words hung in the balance. "This is highly irregular," the female examiner said finally. "Sponsorship arrangements typically involve family connections or established community ties." "With respect, ma'am," Eli said, "nothing about this war was typical. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that the solutions don't have to be typical either." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. A challenge to bureaucrats who'd grown comfortable with standard procedures to recognize that standard procedures might not serve justice in extraordinary circumstances. Outside, Snow had begun falling again, dusting the government building's windows with the same white that had brought them together months before. Inside, 3 strangers held the power to determine whether 2 damaged people would get the chance to heal together or be separated by rules designed for a world that no longer existed. The deliberation lasted 2 hours that felt like days. Lotte and Eli waited in a hallway lined with hard benches and government posters encouraging citizens to buy war bonds for a conflict that had already ended. Through tall windows, they could see Missoula going about its business, people hurrying through the snow, cars navigating slushy streets, the ordinary rhythm of life in a world that had moved on from war. "Whatever happens," Eli said quietly, "you fought for yourself in there." That took courage. Lotte studied his weathered hands, noting the scars and calluses that spoke of decades spent working the land. "I learned from watching you. Sometimes the right thing requires taking risks that other people don't understand." When the door finally opened, the lead examiner's expression revealed nothing. He gestured them back into the hearing room, where the 3 officials had arranged themselves behind their table like judges preparing to render verdict. The fluorescent light seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows that divided the room into zones of light and darkness. "Miss Schneider." "Mr. McBride," the examiner began, "this review board has reached a decision regarding the sponsorship petition." He paused, consulting his notes with maddening deliberation. "The arrangements you've proposed are, as stated, highly unconventional. The War Department typically requires more structured oversight for former enemy nationals seeking permanent residency." Lotte felt her heart sink into her stomach. The careful plans, the job arrangements, the evidence of her qualifications, none of it had been enough to overcome bureaucratic suspicion of anything that deviated from established procedure. "However," the examiner continued, and Lotte caught the word like a lifeline thrown into dark water, "Dr. Hartwell's endorsement carries considerable weight in this community. Her clinic has treated wounded veterans returning from overseas, and her recommendation regarding your medical qualifications has been corroborated by multiple sources." The female examiner leaned forward, her stern expression softening slightly. "Furthermore, the circumstances that brought you and Mr. McBride together represent the kind of international cooperation that this department hopes to foster in post-war reconstruction efforts. Your brother's service to Allied personnel, combined with Mr. McBride's assistance to displaced persons, suggests a pattern of mutual aid that aligns with our national interests." Hope fluttered in Lotte's chest, fragile as a butterfly but growing stronger with each word. The officials were building towards something, not the rejection she'd feared, but perhaps the conditional approval that would give them a chance to prove their arrangement could work. "Therefore," the lead examiner said, "this board approves the sponsorship petition with the following conditions. Miss Schneider will report monthly to the immigration office in Missoula for the first year, quarterly thereafter. She will maintain steady employment and demonstrate integration into the local community. Any changes in residence or employment must be reported within 30 days. The words washed over Lotte like warm water after months of cold. Approved. She was approved to stay in America, to build a life in the country that had first imprisoned her and now offered her freedom. Additionally, the female examiner added, Mr. McBride's sponsorship obligations will be reviewed annually. Failure to meet integration requirements by either party will result in immediate deportation proceedings. Eli nodded gravely, understanding the weight of responsibility he was accepting. We understand the conditions, and we're prepared to meet them. One final matter. The third examiner spoke for the first time, a middle-aged man who'd remained silent throughout the hearing. Miss Schneider, you're aware that accepting this arrangement means renouncing any claim to German citizenship and declaring your intention to become an American citizen within 5 years. The question struck deeper than legal technicalities. It meant severing the last official connection to the country of her birth, to the life she'd known before war swept everything away. Germany wasn't home anymore. It was a memory wrapped in loss and devastation, but cutting that final thread still felt like a small death. She thought of Klaus, of his letters describing wounded soldiers who called for their mothers in languages he didn't understand, of his belief that healing transcended nationality. He died trying to save people regardless of the uniform they wore. Perhaps the best way to honor that memory was to choose a new country, based not on the accident of birth, but on the possibility of building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. "I understand," she said firmly. "I want to become an American citizen." The lead examiner stamped the final document with the kind of bureaucratic flourish that made official what had been only hope moments before. "Congratulations, Miss Schneider. Welcome to the United States of America." Standing outside the government building in the February snow, Lotte felt as if she were emerging from a long tunnel into unexpected sunlight. Free, after 2.5 years of being government property, of existing at the mercy of officials who could relocate or deport her at will. She was finally free to make her own choices about where to live and how to spend her days. Eli touched her elbow gently, his pale eyes bright with something that might have been relief mixed with anticipation. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home. The word carried weight it had lacked for years, not just a place to sleep or shelter from the storm, but somewhere she belonged, somewhere she was wanted for who she was, rather than tolerated as an obligation. "Yes," she said, and for the first time since Klaus's death, the future felt like something worth reaching toward, rather than simply enduring. "I'm ready to go home." 1 year later, Lotte stood in the doorway of Dr. Hartwell's clinic, watching the first snow of another Montana winter dust the streets of Cedar Falls. Her hands, no longer soft from camp idleness, but calloused from honest work, held a letter from the immigration office, her final quarterly report, marking the successful completion of her first year as a sponsored immigrant. The clinic had become more than a workplace. It had become proof that she belonged here, that her skills and dedication could serve this new community that had gradually accepted her as one of their own. Mrs. Henderson from the general store now greeted her by name, asking about her patients and offering advice about preserving vegetables for winter. Jim Carlisle at the post office saved letters from other former camp residents who'd been scattered across the country, maintaining connections to women who understood what it meant to build new lives from the ashes of old ones. "Another satisfied customer," Dr. Hartwell said, joining her at the window. The older woman had become mentor and friend, patiently teaching Lotte the subtleties of American medical practice while learning from her surgical experience gained in field hospitals where resources were scarce and innovation essential. Through the window, they watched Eli's familiar figure emerge from the hardware store, packages tucked under his arm. Thursday was his day in town. Supplies, mail, and the brief social contact that connected his mountain solitude to the broader community. But today was different. Today was the anniversary of the storm that had brought them together. And tonight they would celebrate not just survival, but the life they'd built from that unlikely beginning. The cabin had changed in the year since Lotte's release from the camp. What had once felt like a monument to loss now hummed with the energy of two people learning to share space and purpose. Eli had built additional shelving for her medical books, had cleared garden space where she could grow the herbs that supplemented Dr. Hartwell's pharmaceutical supplies. Small changes, but they added up to transformation. A home that accommodated two lives instead of preserving the memory of what was gone. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, with the deliberate pace of people who'd learned that rushing toward happiness often led to disappointment. They were partners first, in managing the ranch, in navigating the bureaucratic requirements of her residency, in the daily work of building trust between two damaged people. Romance had grown from that foundation like wildflowers emerging from snow, natural and unhurried, and rooted in something deeper than attraction. "You should go," Dr. Hartwell said, noting the direction of Lotte's gaze. "I can handle the afternoon appointments. Besides, a woman should celebrate important anniversaries properly." Lotte smiled, recognizing the gentle push toward personal happiness that had become Dr. Hartwell's way of showing affection. "The Patterson baby isn't due for another week. But if she goes into labor, I delivered babies before you arrived, my dear. And I'll manage one more if necessary. Go. Eli's waiting." The ride to the cabin took them through country transformed by early winter. The same landscape that had nearly killed her now peaceful under a light covering of snow. Eli rode beside her on the bay horse that had carried her to safety, their conversations easy now, seasoned with the comfortable silences of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. "Letter came today," he said, as they approached the cabin. "From the War Department. Final documentation for your permanent residency status. Permanent." The word still carried wonder, even after a year of growing accustomed to the idea that she wouldn't be shipped back to a Germany that existed now only in memory. America was home now, these mountains and this community and this man who'd risked his reputation to give her a chance at belonging somewhere. Inside the cabin, warmth and the smell of dinner welcomed them. Eli had been cooking all day, a feast that honored the anniversary of their meeting and celebrated the life they'd built together. But it was the small wooden box on the table that made Lotte's breath catch. "What's this?" she asked, though something in Eli's expression suggested she already knew. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a ring, simple gold, beautifully crafted, sized to fit hands that had learned to work Montana soil and tend Montana patience. But it was the other item in the box that made her eyes burn with sudden tears. A pressed wildflower, purple and perfect, encased in glass to preserve its delicate beauty. Eli. His name was all she could manage through the tightness in her throat. "I know we agreed to take things slow," he said, his voice carrying the nervousness of a man venturing into territory where rejection could wound deeply. "I know you're still finding your place here, still figuring out who you want to be in this new life. But this year has taught me something I thought I'd forgotten, that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies." He took her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Klaus and Thomas will always be part of our story, but they don't have to be the end of it. We can honor their memory by building something they would have been proud of, a life based on the same kindness they showed each other when everything else was falling apart." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in the same white silence that had brought them together. But inside the cabin, warmth and possibility filled every corner, proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloomed in the most unlikely soil. "Yes," Lotte said, the word emerging strong and clear. "Yes to all of it. To building something beautiful from what was broken. To honoring the past while choosing the future. To you." As Eli slipped the ring onto her finger, Lotte thought of Klaus, of his belief that healing was always possible if people chose kindness over hatred. In this cabin, in this moment, surrounded by the peace of Montana winter and the promise of spring to come, two souls who'd lost everything had found each other and chosen to build something that would outlast both of them. The war was finally over. Their new life was just beginning.